Welcome to the next of our leaders' interviews for this election 2023, and it's not his first rodeo. Winston Peters joins me this morning. Hello, sir.
Hello, and thanks for having me on your program.
No, my pleasure. I saw the video this morning, I must admit. You guys are having a lot of fun with your electioneering this time around.
Well, you know something, this is a pretty boring campaign in some circumstances, and all we were imaging is that it does take experience and knowledge.
Yeah.
And you've got to stay on the horse.
Well, that's right. And of course, if people are wondering what we're talking about, there's a video that's just gone live just this morning.
Yes.
So was this your idea or did somebody pitch it to you? How did that come about?
Somebody pitched it to us.
Yeah.
And I was just majorly concerned that he had got a horse that had been trained, and not one that's going to spend the next 35, 40 seconds trying to buck you off.
Yeah, fair enough. Would have made for a more memorable video for other reasons, right?
Well, not if I'd have stayed on, but I was brought up on a farm, and my grandfather was a horse trainer, and so was my father, apart from being a farmer, from Clydesdales all the way to Shetlands.
Yep.
And we've had a few spills. I'll make no bones about that.
Well, and look, it's true for horses, but it's true in politics as well. And of course, the point you're making with that video is that, I would say you would have to be the most experienced campaigner in this year's election, surely. I think you've been involved in how many elections now?
Well, by miles. I'm not boasting, but
no, absolutely. I think it's fair to boast about.
For some of them, this is their first rodeo.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the point of that advertisement.
Exactly. So, I'm keen to know from you as well. In some ways, every election is different, but there will be common threads. What is unique about 2023 from your perspective?
Unique in that perspective of this election is that the appalling, how shall I say it, standards of the mainstream media. And thank heavens, although it's got many distractions, the social media is some way a replacement. But the mainstream media's sense of reporting or journalism, maybe not all their own fault, but they're not telling both sides of the story. They're not saying, well, Mr. Hipkins said that, and so the other party is saying this. No, they're doing all the interpretation and editorializing themselves so that the listener or the viewer or the reader does not know what the person actually said. I've got people coming to a meeting which is wall to wall. I've had over 750 people in some meetings, and they've never repeated one word I said, even though it was a written speech I delivered so it might help them, and went straight for the angles. Now, that's not reporting. It's a disgrace, and actually it's a challenge to our democracy, because in democracy, people who are the voters are the master, not the servant. The politicians are the servant, and they're entitled to hear what's on the marketplace of ideas and policies, and they're not hearing it. And
an example that we had of that very recently as well was when it was announced in the newspapers. Chris Hipkins came out and said, we're announcing to everybody we're not going to be going into coalition with New Zealand First under any circumstances. Yeah. And this was reported like it was brand new, that this was something that people had never, this was a revelation. But of course, you've been talking about this for how long now? 18 months or longer. The moment I found out that material that was critical to decision-making, and I was the foreign minister, was hidden from me, and other policies as well, I made mine you could not trust them to ever go into coalition with this bunch now. I'd been in government with Helen Clark and Michael Cullen, and in no way over those 3 years did they ever not keep their word. And I was in government with Jim Bolger, and the same reason he never ever failed not to keep his word, whereas Jenny Shipley and Senator Ardern definitely did not, and I can prove it categorically. They had signed up to an agreement and they weren't keeping it. Now, that's unforgivable if we want to have in our country a democracy where things are up front and transparent. And so I'm actually very interested to know as well, you have been through these post-election negotiations and whether or not, again, at the moment, the way the polls are looking, it's a very, there's a good chance that New Zealand First could be in a position to negotiate.
We're way past 6 and 7% already.
Right.
I don't understand these so-called political experts all saying this. They know full well that Talbot Mills' last poll, which was a very reliable but understated poll for New Zealand First, had it at 6. And we're climbing rapidly now. And so it's not a matter of if, and it's not a matter of being immodest or arrogant, but we've worked real hard around the country from Invercargill to Kaitaia and had massive public meetings, none of which have been reported. But they have been on social media and people are following it. And that's why our social media page has got 50,000 more people on it than, for example, Luxon. Now, he's the Prime Minister. He's the leader of the National Party. It's been around since 1936, so No, it's going great.
Yeah, and we'll unpack, I guess, some of the things too you're finding New Zealanders are responding to very much in those meetings too, what you're finding is most important to them. But I am keen to know, because I think you are probably the best person to ask this question about what the negotiations are actually like. I don't know how much of this you can tell us right now, but of course there's all the electioneering. The parties come out and say, this is what's important to us, that's what's important to them. And then, of course, post-election, you walk into the room with these people, as you have done a number of times now. What are they really like? Is it the bit where people sit down and go, okay, we know we said this, but what we mean is this, or this is what's really important, and how much leverage you have in negotiating as a coalition partner?
Well, it depends on the person and depends on their experience as well. The thing that you have to contemplate, and it goes with the territory, so to speak, is on election night, when the voters have spoken, they have set out what they want in terms of the numbers in Parliament.
Sure.
And no matter what your past proclivities or your dislikes may be or your aversions may be, there is something far bigger in front of you, and that is the need to form a stable government. We've been a democracy since 1854. Maori voting was in 1867. Women voting was in 1893. We've been the most comprehensive democracy in the world. And stability is important, and that's all on the line in this election, because democracy itself is under threat with the challenge to the principles and the constitutional rights of ordinary New Zealanders. So you have to say to yourself and tell your colleagues, now look, blank your mind of all your prejudices. The public wants you to do the best in these negotiations and get as much as you can for those things that people voted for you for. Now, sometimes people expect you... you've got, say, 7-8% of the vote, and they expect you to run the whole show. That's not the way it is. Or shall I put it this way? They've given you a microlight, and they expect you to fly to the moon. It can't be done. But we've gone a long way there in the past and been more successful than any other political party in the negotiations, because there's one advantage we've always had over all the rest, and we still will have the same advantage after this election.
So how does it translate, though?
Except I won't be negotiating with Labour, full stop.
Yes, yeah, which you have made very clear.
Well, there's got to be a price for deceit and a price for attack on democracy and a price for racism, and I'm utterly opposed to it, coming with my background. But the thing is that negotiations about whether you're prepared to put it all on the line to get the best you can for the people who voted for you.
And you've been very upfront with, I think there's about 33 odd points that are on the New Zealand First website, just to go through one for one. So, I mean, this might be a crude way to look at it. Does it translate as, you get one point per percentage point? Like when you're going in there to say, how much leverage you have in terms of how many things you can realistically expect to become a part of the next government? Is that, how do you factor in how much of your support?
This has been difficult. This has been difficult in this campaign because of the government's massive overspending, and the current budget has got 14 billion more cost in it than were predicted in the forecasts of when I was in government of 2019. 14 billion more in a worsening economy with China in trouble, and some of the promises being made now are breathtaking. But on the 12th of December will come the pre-election financial or fiscal update. It's the fiscal update that's coming out. And only then we will know what we're dealing with some sort of precision, because so much of what's being said now, as I say, is breathtaking. It is inconceivable that they will be able to deliver on any of those promises given the state of our economy. And as a former treasurer of New Zealand, running the economy during the Asian financial crisis, when we lost up to 80% of some of our Asian markets in 1977, I do know with exactitude exactly what's going to happen here. Because I predicted it some months ago that this is going to get much worse. But no, here we are, and we're there with the mainstream media in a lolly scramble, the sweetness of which will be very bitter when the election's over, because they won't be able to deliver.
And of course, one of the challenges too, which you've had to negotiate a few times, and I think you made a great analogy to it before as well, that is there still, even though we've had MMP in this country for a number of decades now,
we've had it since the vote of
it was 95, wasn't it?
96 it came in, but it was voted for by the people in the second referendum in 1993.
Yeah.
And still the mainstream media can't get their head around it. They keep on thinking it's first past the post. As I was saying the other day in a meeting in Glenfield, one of the editors of the Sunday Times previously in 2017 accused me, virtually 5 days after the election, of holding the government to ransom. Holding the country to ransom, no, is what she said. Holding the country to ransom. Look, the special votes weren't even counted. We didn't know what the final makeup of Parliament might be, and I was being accused of that. Now, the Germans had an election the day after us in 2017. We decided the government, after we knew the votes within 11 days, they took 4 months after that. See the difference?
Oh, yeah,
No
absolutely.
fairness, no balance, no understanding internationally, and just, what I call dirt as criticism. Plain dirt.
And so when it comes to then expectations of a minor party and coalition as well, though, I think, you've come up against that challenge a few times now.
You're not a minor party.
Well,
You're not a minor party if you form 4 different governments.
well, sure.
And we have, uniquely, we're the only party who can make that claim.
Yeah, well, exactly. And, yet for some reason, you'll go into those arrangements and people maybe expect that you're going to be able to set the entire scope of government. And, of course, following election, this is looking like the third time you're going to be returning to government after having some, misfortune in the election previous. What do you count that for? Is it just a matter of people having understandings of how parties should function in coalition that doesn't line up with reality?
Look, 2019, 2020, the COVID, 2019 going into the COVID 2020, the whole world changed. It changed democracy, or the response to that all over the world. And some of the electoral results were catastrophic for parties that should have won. I mean, don't have to like this person or dislike this person, but Trump was going to hose in 2020 until COVID turned up. And then you had circumstances in New Zealand where, look, the National Party was devastated and all sorts of things happened in 2020. And so it happened to us as well. And there's no use complaining about it. I'm off a farm, and I liken to getting the whole crop ready and planting the seeds and doing everything right. And everything's coming up, it's looking beautiful, and all of a sudden you get a hailstorm, a big one, where the hail is the size of big ball bearings, and all your crops destroyed. Now, you learn, well, if I couldn't have stopped that hailstorm, get up off the ground and start again. Look around and see where the mistakes were made. But sometimes it's not the mistake, it's the environment which you're in. And that's what we did. We decided, all right, we've been beaten badly, we'll just start again. Because the circumstances were impossible.
And so, as you mentioned, let's dive into some of the specifics around this as well. In fact, one of the major ideas you've talked about for this election is, let's take back our country. So when we're using a phrase like that, who are we taking it back from? What's the sense of, who has maybe taken control now, and what does taking back that control look like?
Well, they're corroding our democracy with a thing called co-government.
So when you say they, who is they?
Labour and the Green Party and Te Pāti Māori and those that have gone along with those sorts of, the beginnings of those sorts of policies.
Yep.
Policies which I stopped when I was foreign minister and when I had influence, which they have now taken up, and it really means that a person with some ethnic background, part Maori, has got far greater rights in terms of constitutional matters and democracy than the rest of the country. It's just breathtaking what's happened here. And so we're taking back our democracy. The name of the country's been changed right in front of your face. I listen to the Morning Report, I watch TV, they're using the word Aotearoa. That's a French Polynesian name. It doesn't belong here. And it's certainly not the name for South Island, which is Te Waiponamu, as all the people down there, Ngai Tahu, will tell you. But right in front of our face, they've taken the name away without any referendum, any decision, just done it. And we're going to take back the name of the country to New Zealand, which is the country we've spent billions and billions on when we're trying to sell our product offshore, and we're an export-dependent country.
Okay, so you've also talked about, I think, number 4.
I give you 20 things like that.
Sure, and number 4, I think, on your list of commitments talks about the government department name changes as well, and reverting those solely to English names. Some have said, why can't we do both if we're supposed to be, say, a bilingual nation, if nothing else? New Zealand and Māori, you have suggested just the English name, or would you consider maybe using both together? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when you say we're bilingual, we're multilingual now.
Sure.
You can't have those levels of immigration without people still have the language of their ancestors or where the origin of the country from which they come. You've got a whole lot of island people who still speak Pacific Island languages. You've got Chinese still speaking their language. You've got Indians still speaking their language. You've got all sorts of people, probably scores and scores of different languages here. But in the main, we only have 2 official languages, and that's Maori and the language for deaf people, so to speak.
Yeah, New Zealand
English
Sign
is not
Language.
even our official language. And when I said we're going to do that, we're going to make it official, I got the usual cacophony of idiots having a go at me. And my response to that is, oh yes, well go and look at the Plain Language Act. The Plain Language Act requires you to speak in plain language when you're writing the law, excepting they've interposed the right to put Maori in that language, and the moment you put that into a statute and people can't understand it, then all sense of communication is lost, because communication is critically about understanding. If I'm talking to you and you don't understand the thing I'm saying, then I'm not communicating. And so if you go, for example, to the hospital and Te Wharaora has got all sorts of Maori names up there whilst you're not getting treatment, or you're waiting in an ambulance for 4 hours to get out of the ambulance because the emergency department's so packed, or you're waiting 8 years for operation. What's important? It is the delivery of health, not some woke virtue signaling. Because someone not in charge of bilingualism or language, namely the health system, is doing something the education system should be doing. See how confusing that is?
Yeah, and that word woke as well has come up, it's regrettably a part of our vernacular now, I think, especially in the last few years. So, I mean, when you hear the word woke, like how would you define that? What is wokeism in New Zealand?
Well, it's got a range of meanings, and some of them are too complicated, but I think it means, look, I woke up yesterday and now all of a sudden I've got greater conscience, I care about the country more than you, and what I think about is far important than you, regardless of whether you're majority or not. And so, you got Waka Kotahi, which is meant to be fixing up the roads, more interested in putting signposts up in Maori, whereas the Hokianga and the East Coast Maori are, and alongside their European neighbour, just want the potholes fixed up. See what's going on here? You got any spare money, spend it on fixing the potholes up, not potholes that are wrecking vehicles and are dangerous.
And so, as you mentioned beforehand, you just recently had a community meeting in Glenfield, but you've had numbers all over the country now. You're mentioning in the South Island just earlier as well. What are some of the things that you're hearing from those who are coming to those meetings that are the most important to New Zealanders? What are they hoping that you are going to solve for them, or what have they resonated with from your messaging so far that tells you, you're on the right track for representing New Zealanders?
Well, look, we have substantial question time at the end of those speeches, and those are very valuable, sometimes up to 15 questions, but that takes quite a long time. But people are interested, and after all, you're there to have, you're lucky to have a dialogue with the audience, and they come along and we share ideas. That's the whole purpose of a democracy in these political speeches. But they've got a whole lot of concerns about what's going on. I mean, take the transport matter of the roading industry of this country. Our roads are in a mess. There are potholes everywhere. We've got all sorts of now, with Cyclone Gabriel, both in down Hawke's Bay and elsewhere around New Zealand, West Auckland as well, and Coromandel. You've got all these roads shut down. These are critical infrastructural assets that those people need to be fixed now. And the mainstream parties are not paying attention. They're making all sorts of promises. 3 tunnels in Auckland is what Hipkins promised us 2 weeks ago. 2 under the harbour and 1 on the North Shore to link up with light rail that's not even been started yet. This is breathtaking stuff. And, of course, out in the provinces where the great wealth and exports come from, and 82% of the export wealth of this country comes from, their infrastructure is being left and forgotten. And our point in this campaign is to go out and tell people out there, we hear you, we're listening to you, we're going to do something about it. We're going to stop this sort of so-called, quotes, transformative visionary statements being made by people that come to nothing. After all, why is light rail, which started off at $1.8 billion in 2017, in its first meeting, and I was there when the Labour Party tried to put it to us, and we said, what? $2.8 billion, it'll cost you 10 times that. Well, guess what it is now? 20 billion, up to 30 billion, and they still haven't put in 1 metre of it.
Well, but at least a lot of consultants got paid, so,
Well, it costs 50. No, but look, it costs 54 million for the idea of a cycleway over the harbour. How many ordinary people, families, could I got into a house using that money?
Wasteful spending's been a huge point that I think people have been right to.
$1.2 billion on consultants.
Yeah, and
that's $1,200,000 on consultants. Do you get your head around that? $1,200,000 consultant. I think most homeless families could have got a start and got a house.
And so besides infrastructure projects as well, what are some of the other things that you think are the most important? I mean, as I said, you've got a number of commitments that are on the New Zealand First website that people can find.
It's all the fundamentals. Start with the cost of living. It is killing a lot of people now. So one party's got a policy called the squeeze middle. Well, they're not actually getting it clear in their mind. The fact is the cost of living has a number of features about it. And the most critical feature, which is an absence of action, is a failure of the political system to line up the supermarkets and get accountability, or to line up the banks and get accountability. There have been 5 inquiries by Australian politicians in Canberra into Australian banks in Australia, and the same banks in New Zealand, no inquiry at all. And they're making the biggest profits here in New Zealand. Why has not been a response to that? On the supermarkets, Labor promised 15 months ago to have within 3 months, that's 12 months ago, a groceries commissioner. Well, they got there 3 weeks ago, but with no powers, a toothless tiger. No, if you want to do something about it, get out there and give them to know that your intentions are serious and you're not going to put up with being the victims of exorbitant pricing, where some are charging 19% more this year in just 12 months than they were last year. Now, that's what I mean by doing those things. Now, we have said, like, in terms of goods and services tax, we need to look at that. But in many ways, we can do far better than that if we just got a far more accountable system in our supermarkets and in our banking. And New Zealand used to be a low-cost country when it came to those things. And now we're one of the highest in the world, and it's just as a result of political failure. I'm not just fobbing it off, but this is something I've argued for a long time for. And people ask you, well, what have you done about it? And the answer is, well, here we go again. You give me a microlight, you want me to fly to the moon. I can't get there, but if you vote for me in greater numbers, I will get there, such as turning around the attack on older people, the 66% net average wage that goes to older people these days in terms of super is there because we legislated that after it had been taken down to 60. The surtax, which was at 92 cents in a dollar, so they get nothing for some of them, we got rid of that, and then we got the Super Gold card. And the Super Gold card's been of enormous help to older people. We can do a whole lot more. We've got hearing aid subsidies and rebates, and we've also got winter energy payment. But we can do a whole lot more, and that's what the plan is in 2023, is to get the politicians back to not their dream projects, but to all the basics in the cost of living, in health, in education.
Well, let's talk about then a few of the other issues as well that our listeners have got in touch with questions about. And I know you have strong feelings about this first point too, but do we have a problem with free speech in New Zealand?
No, we don't, because that's free speech is the critical essential difference between democracy and dictatorships.
So are people experiencing then the application of free speech, or is your sense that maybe voices are being silenced in some capacity? Or you mentioned, say, for example, the media.
Have you heard the saying, better to remain silent than to open your mouth and be thought a fool?
Yeah.
Or to remove all doubt.
Yeah.
Now, free speech goes like this. The person might be saying something idiotic and stupid, but they should have the right to say it. And you'll even find it sometimes in your own family around the dinner table.
Look, I'll say it in my own life every now and then, just quietly. So it's a lesson I've had to learn too.
But free speech is a critical component, and any attack on that is the beginning of tyranny and dictatorships. What is the unique feature of democracies versus all those other countries? In those other countries, you cannot afford to even think wrong. You can't even afford to think of the mistake, because in one of your actions, whether you open your mouth or not, might image it, and now you're in trouble. That's right. Not the side I want to belong to.
So another question then that's very relevant to our audience is, would you change anything about the current abortion laws in New Zealand?
Look, the reality is that our policy has long been that abortion should be safe, it should be legal, and it should be rare. That's been my personal position, and I've not changed from that, but we have always had the view on this issue that it's not what Winston Peters or my colleagues think it should be put to the people of this country in a referendum. And that's the critical difference between us and others who say, no, we've got in Parliament and we've got the right conscience and we can make the decision. The answer is no, you don't. You're only temporarily empowered. Some of you are going to be gone tomorrow. You hardly arrived yesterday. Why don't you ask the people? And as Winston Churchill said, trust the people.
Now, this is a side question to me because I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things that, again, speaking of your longevity in politics, and we've had a lot of people who have come and gone from the political sphere over the last few years in particular. Is it one of those things where you can kind of look across the aisle and know which ones are going to be around for a while longer or not? Like, what do you think leads to longevity? And is there anything you see in people who go like, I'm not going to see you around in 3 years, am I, son?
Well, you can't afford to do that because frankly, it images a sense of arrogance. And also, can I just say, and it goes across a lot of parties, there are some good people, even in the party you don't like. That is, they might be misguided, but they are basically decent New Zealanders. And all I'm interested in are these people, are they patriots or not? Do they actually believe in their country, or do they believe in some international purpose without any regard to what New Zealanders think? And so whilst it's a trend in some political parties to hate everybody else, that is a very, very unfortunate circumstance, because you're required to work with people in Parliament to try and get the best outcomes. And sometimes, just possibly, another party might have a better idea on this issue than you have. So just kindly, as they say, listen in and just make sure that you make the progress.
So back to a question then from one of our listeners on this front then. How would you stop talent from leaving New Zealand?
That is a very, very disquieting question, because we all used to have OE. I went overseas to work in the BHP in Newcastle on the blast furnace floor, and then in Snowy Mountains, 11 miles through the ground, and as a tunneler. And we went over for overseas experience, but now it's OF, overseas forever. That's the tragedy. And the only way you can stop people from leaving this country is pay them competitively. And that's why New Zealand First wants to get back to the basics before you make all these highfalutin promises. Let's pay our young, talented people, in which we have invested 18 years of education, to stay and make and create our future economy, not for free, the economy of some other country. The big beneficiary in our mistakes is Australia now.
Okay, so for this next part of the interview, one thing that I've been doing with each of the leaders that have come through is something I like to call Pass It On, where the previous leader gets to ask a question of the next, and then, of course, you have the privilege for the person following you. So Chris Luxon was in studio before yourself a few days ago, and he had a question for you, and that question was, how would you unite New Zealand?
Well, first of all, my party represents that name and that image and that dream. Our party is called New Zealand First, not second, third, fourth or fifth, or in reading and literature and economic performance way down the bottom. No, we want New Zealand first, New Zealand to be first again. That's why the party's called New Zealand First. The second thing is the unity based on governance for the mass majority, not the chosen few. And whatever criticism they might make of New Zealand First, we are not a party for a minority. We're a party that kept our focus on the fact that you need a successful business to pay wages and proper wages to successful workers. That we're all in this together. There's a pact that we need to have that says if we put our unity and our labour and our sweat and toil together, we can recreate this country's wealth and be a much more successful country. That's what unity is based on. It's remembering this. It's called democracy. Democracy is about majorities, hopefully mass majority, not minorities.
Well, look, the leader who's going to be following you in the studio is going to be Carmel Sepuloni, Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand. So do you have a question you'd like to ask her?
Well, again, it might be a marvellous strategy you've got, but no, I haven't got a question to ask her because I was there for 3 years and they hid material from me, and I'm not interested in asking any more questions because I know that there's got to be a price for that sort of deceit. I'm not blaming her personally. She's a nice person. But I don't have any questions for a party that I was horrified, and my colleagues were horrified to find had done that. Okay,
so then the final question, why should a Christian vote for New Zealand First?
Well, if you put it that way, when we talk about democracy, democracy is the flower of the Judeo-Christian ancestry of this country. It flourished in all sorts of countries, but all of them have that similar, identical origin. And I understand that, first of all. I'm not ashamed to say that I happen to be Protestant. Had I been born a Catholic, I'd be probably proud of that, or any other religion. But I'm not ashamed of my background or the fact that I did Hebrew for my language at university, and the Old Testament was my textbook, so to speak, because when I was young, I came to the conclusion that there were two things that one needed to understand with great clarity, was the Old Testament in particular, and the works and the books of Shakespeare. And you got a pretty good grounding in the fact that all the human foibles, failings, and attributes have never changed. Jealousy, envy, love, charity have never changed. So, it's, how shall I put it? Asking that question in terms of who should a Christian vote for begs someone to act in a way that's not, how shall I say, applauded by the gospel in a sense. You're meant to be humble. You get my point here?
I do.
And humility prevents me going on any further.
Well, Winston Peters, we really appreciate you making the time to talk to us today, and we look forward to seeing how the election results go, potentially in your favour in a few weeks' time. But Winston Peters from New Zealand First, thank you again.
Well, look, thank you very much. But I want to say to all your listeners, whatever you think or what you intend to do, for goodness sake, get enrolled and take part in this election, because your democracy is hanging by a thread and you need to do something about it, not for Winston Peters or New Zealand First, but for your children and your grandchildren's sake. Thanks.